Gold has been rising fast over the last year, breaking new highs not seen for 6 years. But in this video, I'm going to show you how gold reaching 5,000, 10,000, even 50,000 is not just possible, but is actually likely. Now, this is the same analysis that gold analysts like Jim Rickards has been using, and I'm just breaking it down into 3 simple steps. And at the end, I'm going to tell you exactly how you should be positioned to take advantage of this. And if you don't want to make it to the end, I created a free report and I linked it down below. So grab that either way, but just stay tuned. All right, welcome back. If you are new to the channel, my name is Mark Moss. I like to talk about making money. I like to talk about making our money make money, investing, of course. I like to talk about just general success principles. I like to talk about cryptocurrencies a lot, the US, the global financial system, what's happening with it, and of course, how we can profit from it, right? That's where we're paying attention. So if you like these types of topics, click the like button and click the subscribe button right now. Make sure to hit the bell so you're notified every time I put out a new video. And we are going to talk about gold going to as high as $50,000. Now, I know that sounds crazy, right? I mean, gold's not even at 2,000 yet. So gold can get to 2,000 and it's probably going to hit 2,000 pretty quickly. Once it does, smooth sailing to 5,000, 10,000, and potentially even 50,000 like Jim Rickards claims. Now, Jim Rickards has been reporting on the economy for a long time, particularly the currency system, the gold system. I believe he's an ex-CIA person that has, some inner workings with the government and kind of knows what's going on. Someone that I've been following for a long time. And he went out and said that gold is going to get to about $50,000. And I looked at that. I've looked at a bunch of the information that he's been talking about. Like I said, I've been following him for years and years and years. And I broke it down and I broke down the math, and it's actually much easier than you think it is. And I think it could even get to $100,000. If we get to 50, why not just go all the way to 100? So I'm going to show you how Jim Rickards broke down his math, how he got to that number, and how that number might be actually pretty conservative. I'm going to give you the short history. Now, if you've been watching my channel for any amount of time, you know that I love history. I try to always reference history because I believe history tells us where we're going. But in this video, I'm not going to go that far back. I'm going to go back a little bit further in a minute. But first of all, gold's been money for 5,000 years, right? 5,000 years or more, gold's been the money. And it's been money for many, many reasons. I'm not going to go into all those right now. I've made a bunch of videos about that. If you want to know more, leave me a comment down below and I'll expand on that. But gold has been used as money for 5,000 years. Now, as recently as the early 1900s, about 100 years ago, JP Morgan from JP Morgan Bank testified before Congress, and he said, gold is money. Everything else is credit, right? Gold was money. Everyone knew gold was money. 5,000 years of history, he said gold was money. And up until 1971, which isn't that long ago, the US dollar and almost all currencies around the world were still tied to and backed to gold. That's right. They were all gold. So gold has been money for 5,000 years. It was money 100 years ago. It was money 1971. And in 1971, 32 US dollars equaled 1 ounce of gold. So you could go take $32 and go redeem it and actually get gold for it any time. Now, of course, today, gold shot well up over $1,500 for 1 ounce of gold. So gone from $3,200 to over $1,500 for an ounce of gold. So how? How did it go, how did it go from $32 to $1,500? I mean, that's a really big step. But to go from 1,500 to 50,000 is an even bigger step. And like I said, I'm going to show you in 3 simple steps here right now. So in order for gold to go from $32, so gold had pretty much been around $20 an ounce for 100, 200 years. Around World War I, II, Bretton Woods Agreement, 1944, it went up to about $32 an ounce, where it stayed until 1971. Only in 1971 did it start skyrocketing from $32, $200, $400, $800, $1,200, and up to $1,500. All right. Now, it's not that gold got more expensive. It's that the dollar became worth less. As a matter of fact, the dollar's lost over 95% of its purchasing power. So it just takes more dollars to buy gold today. So gold is still worth what gold is. An ounce of gold is an ounce of gold. It just takes more dollars to do that. And so in order for us to get to $10,000, $15,000, $50,000 an ounce of gold, that just means that the dollars continue to buy less and less and less. So the first way, the step number one for this to happen is that the dollar collapses. Now, this is something I've talked about a lot. I've talked about it extensively. I've made a bunch of videos. If you go back to the video thing, through the video list, you'll see them. I made this video up here, the Bank of England said what, where I talked about all the central banks around the world were meeting together, and the head of the central bank was Bank of England was calling to say we need to end the U.S. dollar's reign and we need to usher in a new currency. So that's one about the dollar collapsing. In this video right here, it's called the Next Global Monetary System, and I talked about how an alternative monetary system is being built by our allies, by other governments right now. And they're already starting to build systems to get out of the dollar. In this video right here, this is the end of the global dollar standard. And I did this in 2 videos, part 1 and 2. And I talked about how the global dollar standard is changing. In this video right here, I talked about how Bitcoin takes over as the US dollar reserve status. So you can see I've talked about this a lot, so I'm not going to go super deep into it. Go watch those videos. I have many more. But basically, all analysts are talking about this because it's pretty much inevitable, right? The writing is on the wall. We can see what's going on. And there's basically 2 different schools of thought on why, how, or I should say how the dollar dies. So some people think massive inflation. So we're going to see just take more and more and more dollars to buy the same things. And so some of the guys that talk about this a lot, Brent Johnson, Jeff Snyder, Jim Rogers, and they all talk about this. And we've seen it happen over and over. So the famous example was at the end of World War II, Weimar Republic in Germany, right? That was a famous case. And people were having to get paid multiple times a day because their currency was losing value so fast that they get paid to go buy their stuff, get paid to go buy their stuff. And we've seen it happen more recently in Zimbabwe. I have a couple $1 trillion bills laying around here somewhere. I should have brought them on the video. We've seen it in Mexico in the 80s with their peso. They had to make a nueva peso, a new peso, and chop off zeros off of it. Venezuela in the last year. Argentina, as I'm talking right now, massive inflation. We've been seeing that. The other side of the argument is massive deflation. And this guy's like Peter Schiff, Jim Rickards, Harry Dent, and those are all very prominent analysts. And so is it going to be inflation or is it going to be deflation? Well, the one thing that they both have in common is that whether it goes up first or it goes down first, they all seen it basically collapse. It's just how that it collapses. And with deflation, like I said, I've talked about that a lot. Basically what happens is you start to have diminishing returns. So they're pumping in money into the system, but no matter how much money, right, the Fed's put in $4 trillion, no matter how much money they put in, it's just having less and less effect on the economy, right? And eventually it just doesn't work anymore. And so again, I'm not going to go into deflation. You can go watch those other videos. But inflation is happening, from the money supply going up, and that drives interest rates down as well. And so interest rates around the world have been dropping. As a matter of fact, half the world's governments today, their bonds, which are basically debt, are negative yielding. That means instead of paying interest to borrow money, you have to pay them to borrow it. And so what happens? Well, since all those countries, their valuations have been pushed down, negative interest rates, everyone's coming into the U.S. dollar. And they're coming into the U.S. dollar for better returns. And we see this becoming a problem. We see all over the news, like President Trump has been tweeting about the Fed, right? He's been tweeting like this tweet right here. He said, the Fed mistakenly raised interest rates. There is very little inflation. So he's like, look, we're not having inflation. And the Fed says our target is a 2% inflation. We're not seeing that. We need to print more money to get that inflation that we need. The opposite of inflation is deflation, right? In this tweet right here, he says, we need to get our interest rate down to 0 or less. Well, what's less? No inflation. And the Federal Reserve doesn't allow us to do what other countries are already doing. And what's that? What are they already doing? Well, they're getting paid to borrow money, right? He went on to say, at the G7 in France, leaders are giddy about low interest rates. And he says that Germany is actually getting paid to borrow money. So that's what's happening. That's all pushing to inflation. Now, One analyst that I've been following, Jeff Snyder, he went on to talk about the euro dollar and shadow banking. Now, this is a pretty deep subject. If you want to know more about this, leave it in the comments down below. Maybe I'll make a whole video about this. I'm not going to go super deep into it. But basically, you have this euro dollar and shadow banking system where, as I've talked about before, banks create money through debt, right? So the fractional reserve banking system, they take like $100,000 of deposit, and then they can create $1 million out of that and loan that out, right? So they're creating money out of debt. Now, the U.S. has minimum reserve requirements for banks. So the banks aren't allowed to create more money than their minimum reserve requirements. But in Europe, the banks don't have that. They don't have the same reserve requirements that we do. They're outside of the U.S. Federal Reserve. And so basically, the banks in Europe are taking in U.S. dollars and they're creating unlimited amounts of dollars. As a matter of fact, the Fed, the government, nobody even knows how much dollars are in the system, how much they've inflated the supply. We don't even know how much money is out there. Like I said, this is a big subject that I'm not going to go into super deep on this video, but if you want to know more, leave it in the comments down below. So step one is into the dollar. That's it. Step one, into the dollar. It's either going to happen through inflation or it's going to happen through deflation. Doesn't matter. At the end, they both end up with the dollar crashing. Now, step two, we go back to gold. All right. Now, this is where Jim Rickards comes in. Like I said, he's been part of the CIA and he studies these governments and meets with world leaders and so forth. And he says that when the dollar crashes, which is the reserve currency of the world, the IMF is going to come in to save the monetary system with SDRs. Now, the IMF is the International Monetary Fund, which is basically above the central banks, and it manages all the currencies of the world. And they're going to come in to save the monetary system because no one's going to trust it anymore. I can't trust any currency. I mean, if the US dollar crashes, no currencies can be trusted. And the IMF keeps what's known as SDRs, their special drawing rights. And so it's a basket of currencies. I've talked about this before. I talked about it in this video about China's secret plan and wanting to get in SDRs. But basically, they have a basket of currencies. And so they're going to come in and save it with a brand new SDR. And fiat currency of the IMF, the basket of currencies, he says that because after the fiat crash, no one's going to trust it, the world won't accept it, that they're going to have no choice but to go back to a gold standard. They're going to have to, because no matter what fiat currency they have, no one's going to trust it. The whole world, the whole world's currencies have lost. And so in order to restore confidence, they'll go back to the gold standard. Now, the most common argument to this is that there's not enough gold, right? I made the comment in that video I just pointed to about China and how China wants to come out with a gold-backed currency. And people say there's not enough gold. There's too much money. Well, here's the thing. There is enough gold at the right price. You have to revalue the gold, and I'm going to show you how that works. Now, okay, I can't resist. I have to go back in history just a little bit. I love this. This is a very, very important piece you have to understand. It backs up my point about revaluing gold. So at the end of World War I, England went off the gold standard to pay for the war. So at that time, gold was $20 an ounce. And basically England was the world superpower, and they were fighting this World War I, and they ran out of money. So they went off the gold standard, start creating more currency to pay for the war. Well, after the war, Churchill, he said, let's go back to the gold standard. And at the time, when they went off, it was $20 an ounce. And Churchill says, we're going to go back to the gold standard, and it's going to be $20 an ounce. And Keynes, the father of Keynesian economics, said, hang on. Wait a minute. He says, you can't do that because you've doubled the money supply. You've inflated the money supply. So if you go back to the same gold standard, it's going to cause this massive deflation, and it's going to go into deflation and depression. And he said, what you need to do, Churchill, is you need to revalue gold to be $40 an ounce. It was 20, but since you've doubled the money supply, now gold has to be doubled. It needs to be $40 an ounce because that's what matches up with the money supply. But as history tells us, Churchill didn't take his advice. Now, what happened is he was right. We got massive deflation, and this led into the Great Depression, right? That's what led into it, the Great Depression. So we know from history, you can't just go back to the old gold standards. You have to look at the way that the money supply has been changed, and you need to revalue gold based off of that, okay? That's what history tells us. Hopefully we're smart enough to learn from that. That's why I always talk about it. So that's step number 2. Step number 3, the math. All right, so here's how it works. It's actually pretty simple, elementary math, I would say. So You have to understand how the gold system is set up. So the Fed, again, we've gone off the gold standard in 1971, so the Fed has just been creating more and more money. And we can look at the Fed chart. They call it M1, and they have M2, and that's basically what they estimate the money supply to be. And so what we can do is we can take M1 or M2 money supply for the major currencies. And then, so we take all the money supply for the major currencies, and then we take the ounces of gold that these countries claim to have. And then we decide what gold standard we want. Do we want it to be 100% backed by gold, 50% backed by gold, 40% backed by gold, whatever? And that's it. So it's super easy math, like I said, elementary math. So for example, if we had $100 of currency and I had 25 ounces of gold, $100 of currency, 25 ounces of gold, and I wanted to have 50% gold backed. Well, 50% of 100 is 50. 50 divided by the 25 ounces of gold comes out to $2. So I end up with $2 per ounce of gold. Super, super math. But for real numbers, let's take a look at the real numbers. So the US dollar reported by the Fed, they report on what they think is M1, is about $4 trillion. Now, the US government also reports that they have about 8,000 tons of gold. I don't think I believe that number. Leave me in the comments. Let me know if you believe that number. But that's about what they say. They have about 8,000 tons of gold. Now, that breaks down to about 256 ounces. All right. So if the U.S. was going to go back to the gold standard and be a 100% gold-backed standard, they'd have $4 trillion divided by 256 ounces gives us a gold price of $15,265 per ounce. $15,000 per ounce of gold. But that's just M1. The US dollar M2 is actually about $15 trillion. So then we take the $15 trillion and 8 tons of gold, or 256 ounces. So we take the $15 trillion divided by the 256 ounces, and that gives us a gold price per ounce of $58,500. So over $58,000 for an ounce of gold if the U.S. was going to go back to a 100% gold standard. Now, Jim Rickards' math is a little bit different. He estimates somewhere between 10 to 50,000. And he was looking at the M2 with multiple major currencies. So not just the US dollar. If this happened and the IMF stepped in, they would do it with all the currencies. So then we'd look at the major currencies, the US dollar, the euro, the yen, yuan. And then we'd look at the number of ounces of gold that all these countries had together. And then he used like a very conservative, like a 40% gold standard. Forget going 100%. We'll just go to 40% gold standard. And he puts the math at over $50,000 just for that, even at a 40% gold standard. Now, why is that number conservative? And as crazy as this sounds, how could it even get to 100,000? Well, M1 and M2 numbers from the Fed don't count this entire shadow banking system that I talked about, right? So there's this entire shadow banking system that Snyder talks about that is unknown how big it is. And Snyder says that there's been so many euro dollars created that it's actually the world reserve currency. He says it's the dollar is not the reserve currency. The euro dollar is actually the reserve currency. It's so big. So just conservatively, then what we'll do is we'll just double the M2. So let's say it's not bigger than the US. Let's just say it's the same size. So we'll just double that and M2. And if we double that M2, by doubling that number, we get to over $100,000 per ounce, which I know sounds crazy, but that's a conservative estimate because supposedly the euro dollar is even bigger. So, and this is not just dollars created outside the system, right? That's euro dollars. We also have euro yen. We have euro euros. We have all this money that's been created. I mean, the money supply has just been expanded exponentially since 1971. Estimates of global currencies are about 80 to 90 trillion. I was just saying 4 trillion or 15 trillion, but estimates of global currencies are 80 to 90 trillion. And to put that into comparison, that's tiny because the derivatives market, which are these investment banks basically betting in the financial system is over 1.2 quadrillion. Now, I don't even know what that number is. That's so high, I can't even think about it. But as you can see on the screen, we'll just kind of compare how big that is. Look at how big 1.2 quadrillion is compared to the rest of the assets that we have. It gives you a good visual idea of how massive that is. And so now I think you can see how conservative the $100,000 price is, right? I mean, it's massive. And we have to have learned from Churchill's mistake, right? We can't just go back to the old gold standard price. We'd have to go back to a revalued one. So even if we had to err on one side, we'd want to err on the upside, not the downside, because the Fed's already doing everything they can to make sure we don't go into another recession. And so if they were going to err, they'd want to err on the positive side, not on the bottom side. So what's the chance of this happening? What's the chance of happening? Well, I'd say the chance is very great, right? The chance is very great. We almost certainly know what the outcome is. It's only been since 1971. We're less than 50 years into this experiment of having basically a fiat currency that's not backed by anything. And in 50 years, we've racked up $1.2 quadrillion out of thin air. The system is falling apart. Governments around the world are paying people to borrow money. There's no yield. We're seeing smaller countries drop like flies right now all around us. And it's really only a matter of time. I mean, it's almost certain. Now, just because it's certain doesn't mean that we know exactly when it can happen. Now, it could happen next year. It could happen 20 years from now. That's the thing. We don't know. So we just have to pay attention. So that's what we should be doing. We need to be paying attention, watching the signs. That's why I make these videos. I'm trying to keep you up to date. We need to buy assets that keep up with inflation, because holding dollars, you're just going to be losing money. But if you take your dollars and put them into assets that inflate up, you'll keep up with inflation. Like if you would have bought a house 10 years ago, it doubled in value, right? So it's kept up with inflation. We also want to hedge against a collapse. We do that through buying gold, precious metals, gold miners, things like that. So hopefully you have a good plan for that. If you want to know a little bit more how to do that, I put together this free report. It's pretty cool. It's like 20 pages. It'll walk you through it. I'm going to go ahead and put a link to it in the description down below and check it out. Highly recommend that because the world is shaky. Gold could go higher. Hopefully you own a little bit. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Smash that like button if you haven't already. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel. If you don't like the video, give me a thumbs down either way, but let me know in the comments down below. And that's it. To your success. I'm out.